Hi everyone. I just read Chapter 2 of My System by Nimzowitsch, and Chapter 2 is called On Open Files, and he gives his definition and theory behind files, playing along the files. He calls a file open if you have no friendly pawn on that file, then you have an open file. Like in the position here, white has the open E file because he has no E pawn, and black has an open D file because he has no D pawn. Today we might call those semi-open files, and we reserve the term open file to mean there are no pawns of either color. But he doesn't use that term semi-open, he just calls these open files. All right, so in this position, with white to move, you can assess the position and deem that black has the upper hand here. Black has better development, of course, if you compare the bishops. Black's bishops are both on the long diagonals and they're exerting a lot of pressure. So the dark square bishop here is exerting pressure on the b2 square. In fact, I think black is just threatening to win a pawn here by exchanging knights, like exchanging here and then here, and drawing this bishop off of c1 and eventually taking on b2. And this bishop is exerting a lot of pressure as well, and these are well centralized knights. So because of this, without analyzing in the position in detail here, we can understand that white wants to trade off black's centralized knights. But here are the consequences of doing so. Because black has such good knights and he's forcing white to trade them, black is going to gain something from that. If white plays knight takes d4, then c takes d4, and all of a sudden black has an open c file. That open c file is stronger than the open d file he just had a moment ago, and the reason is in this open c file situation you can see this pawn is a backward pawn. It doesn't have any pawns defending it, and this pawn has it under control if it tries to move forward. But when you back up in the original position, you can say black has the open d file here, but it's facing this pawn which is anchored by another pawn, and that's not as strong. So after this trade, that c file is a much better file for black to own. And then white trades another pair of knights, chases the queen off, there was a mate threat on g2, and then trades a pair of bishops. And now you can see, even after all those trades, and white alleviated some of his problems of development, black still has the upper hand here because of the control of the c file against this backward pawn, or whatever you want to call that pawn. I don't know if it's technically backward. But because of the pressure that black can exert on that pawn, he has the upper hand. Yes, white does have the open e file, but that pawn can always be pushed to e6 and be anchored by another pawn. Okay, so here white decided he can't abide by, he can't just let this pawn sit here on c2 and let black double up his rooks and play down that file. So he tries to push it, and black takes en passant, white recaptures, and we'll stop this example here just to say that black went on to get his rooks on his open C and D files and got a lot of play against that pair of pawns. And the lesson that Nimzowitsch wants us to learn from this position is that if you have strongly placed centralized pieces, then you may induce your opponent to trade them and allow you to open files in your favor. Specifically centralized pieces. He says if you have pieces posted on the flanks, then you're never going to induce your opponent to trade them and open up files. Okay, let's take a look at this position. Now it's black to move. Black can take on e3, but if he does so, then f takes e3 will open up the f file for white. And he might not want to do that. So suppose black retreats his bishop to b6, and then the players continue to develop. They castle. And now Nimzowitsch says that if black plays h6, that's a mistake. Now the reason that's a mistake is because that allows white a clear plan to open the G file. I'll call this pawn a hook. It's a hook into black's position that white can play off of. And just the fact that that pawn is there allows white to play h3, g4, and g5. And then g takes h6 will open the G file, and he'll put a rook on g1. So that's just something, we're not going to analyze down this particular path, but that's just something to be aware of when a pawn pushes forward from the normal castle king side like this. It can become a hook, and you can try to force open a file. And here's another example of that. So in this position, let's say it's white to move. So this time we have a hook on the g6 square. And so one of white's possible plans is to play h4 and h5, and then h takes g6 and open the h file this time against that particular hook. Now, of course, there's a knight here that's poised to capture any pawn that lands on h5. So at some point, white should probably play knight to d5 to try to get rid of that knight on f6 before he enacts this plan. And he might do it even here. It's not so simple, though. I tried to play this out against the engine on the top level, and black threw a lot of wrenches into the position, and it was quite difficult to enact that plan of opening the H file. But it's just something to be aware of. Okay, so now Nimzowitsch wants to tell us what's the idea of opening a file, what do you gain? And he talks about two things that you gain when you open a file in your favor and you control a file with a heavy piece. One is you can often infiltrate to the 7th or 8th ranks to your advantage and maybe win some material or checkmate. So that's often the goal of controlling a file, is getting to the 7th or 8th rank. Sometimes he says, though, you want to control a file so that you can just go up the file. He calls it restricted development up the file. And I think the term we use today for that is a rook lift, where you take a rook, or maybe a queen, but probably not a queen because queens can go diagonally. But you take a rook and you go up a file a few squares in order to then move laterally left or right and then make use of another file. So those are the two reasons, the restricted development along a file and then penetration all the way to the 7th or 8th rank. Those are the two reasons you want to control a file. And he shows us some simple examples. So in addition to giving us his positional theories, sometimes the positions in the book are just little exercises in tactics. So here let's see how white can win. And white would play queen to h1 check and make use of this open h file. King's forced over, and now he penetrates to the 7th rank, supported by his pawn. Okay, forcing the king over. Now he penetrates to the 8th rank, and he skewers the queen, so he wins the black queen. So all because of that open file. Now here's a similar position where we just moved the black king from here, the black queen from there to there. Let's see what the difference is. White can still play queen to h1 check, and then penetrate to the 7th rank like this, and then to the 8th rank, forcing the king here. But this time he hasn't skewered a queen, but instead he takes this pawn. And by the way, Nimzowitsch has little pet names for all these kind of maneuvers where you make this little, he calls this little triangle thing. I forget what he calls it, but he has little pet names for all these things that never caught on. Nobody uses them today. But anyway, here's the point now. Wherever this king moves in contact with the queen, white's going to trade and then promote his pawn. So another little tactical exercise. Okay, let's look at this position. All right, so clearly there's an open F file, but white also has this open H file, or you might call it a semi-open file. And on the H file, there's a target. There's a pawn on H6. And so Nimzowitsch talks about how to deal with targets like that. And he talks about how white can pile up as many pieces as possible to attack it, and black will probably respond in kind by protecting it the same number of times it's attacked. And if black is successful in protecting that weak point on the file, then sometimes white transfers the attack to the defending pieces. Instead of attacking that pawn on h6, he might start trying to remove some of the defenders and attack some of black's pieces that are defending h6. Or, as we will see in this position, sometimes after it's a standstill, a deadlock on h6, white may interrupt some of the black defense of h6. Let's see how that happens here. So white can move a rook to the h file, king comes up to protect, and move another rook to the h file. Let's say the bishop falls back to protect, and then white attacks the h6 pawn for a third time with his knight. So black needs to bring a rook up to that sixth rank to protect it. So do you see a good move for white here? So from what I was saying earlier, you probably see the move d6. That interrupts the protection of that pawn on h6, and so white's going to win that pawn on the next move. And then there, in the chapter, there's a very similar position given where Nimzowitsch has just transferred the rook from a8 to a6 here and says, okay, let's play on from here. What can black do about this threat on h6? And Nimzowitsch says perhaps black can sacrifice the exchange for a pawn in order to continue to defend h6. I think it's still pretty clearly winning for white, but that may be black's best hope. And Nimzowitsch points out that you cannot take the pawn with the bishop because you're going to get mated. And so this is just another tactical exercise. This is just another illustration of penetration down a file. Here's how play would proceed. Check, forces the king to g8, check, forces it to f7, check, and then the king has to come up to the sixth rank there. Then this move wins. That rook is protected by the knight. It's cutting the black king off on the seventh rank, and the other rook is going to come to h6 and mate black. So that move, bishop takes pawn, was too greedy. It cut off the defense of these rooks here, and white was able to mate black. Okay, let's look at this position and learn another one of Nimzowicz's positional points he wants to make. So here, white has the open D file, and he points out it would be kind of senseless to try to double up on that file because there's a pawn there that's protected by another pawn. He calls that a granite wall. You don't want to bite up against granite. You don't want to try to gain a file if you're not going to be productive on that file. So what Nimzowitsch recommends doing, or at least he's trying to make a point, not all these positions are analyzed, in detail, and he's not trying to always discover lines of best play. He's just trying to illustrate these different positional points. But Nimzowitsch says you can move knight to d5 here. And he calls this an outpost because it's protected by the pawn and it's in the enemy territory. That knight is on the other half of the board. Today, I don't think people call that an outpost because it can be driven away by an enemy pawn. Usually an outpost is a square that's safe from ever being driven away by enemy pawns. But it doesn't matter what you call it. Nimzowitsch is calling that an outpost. And here is his point. He's saying that that knight is so strong in the center of the board that black eventually is going to push c6 to drive it away. And that accomplishes white's goal. he's broken down the granite wall. That pawn is no longer supported by another pawn, and now white can double up on the d file and get some play on that file. Whether it's winning or not is another story, but that's the point. Sometimes you put a piece on an outpost in order to induce your opponent to chase it away and weaken his pawn structure. So now white gets some play against d6. Nimzowitsch does mention that perhaps a master here would not play c6. He would play one of his rooks. He'd play rook f to c8 to protect that pawn, which looks passive, but that might be best play. All right, let's look at this position to also talk about outposts. Here, white has an outpost on the f5 square. He'd like to get this knight over to that square. And there are two reasons. One, he may induce black to push his pawn to g6 and weaken this granite wall. If he can get that pawn pushed to g6, then he can double the rooks on the f file and play against the f6 point. And two, if black doesn't push g6, then the knight is very strong on f5 and it can help actually attack g7. Maybe white can do a little rook lift and attack g7. So that's the outpost white should have his eye on. Now likewise, black has an outpost too. Black wants to get his bishop to that d4 square. His king would probably be moved over to h1, and this knight would be out of the way, like that. And so the point of putting the bishop on the d4 square, besides centralizing your bishop and getting it on a strong diagonal, is to try to induce white to push his pawn to c3, thereby weakening that granite wall on d3, so black can get some play down the d file, his open file. So when you have an open file, you're trying to break down those granite walls, as Nimzowitsch says. Okay, let's look at this position. So another positional point piece of advice Nimzowitsch gives us is, if you look at this open G file, both players have a rook on that file. Neither player controls it right now. But it's white to move, and white is tempted to place a piece on g6, supported by both of his pawns. But the question is, which piece should white put there? Should he put a knight or rook? And Nimzowitsch tells us that when you have an open file with an advanced point supported by a pawn or two, and you want to place a piece on that point, then whether you place a minor piece or a rook depends on whether it's a central file, which means C, D, E, or F file, or whether it's a flank file, which means A, B, G, or H file. He says for flank files, the general rule of thumb is put your rook on that far advanced point. That's what we're going to do in this position, play rook to g6. Why not knight to g6? Well, when it's a flank file like this, Nimzowitsch simply says that the knight doesn't have as much mobility when it's near or on the edge of the board. It would be even worse on the H file, but here it doesn't have as much mobility. They're missing squares that the knight can't go to the right of the H file. So it's not as effective there. But if it were a central file, posting a knight on a square like that could be very effective. The knight would have a far range. But here the move is rook to g6. That's the correct move. And since white is threatening to double rooks with rook dg1, black would probably exchange, and now white has this protected passed pawn. We won't look any further, but I'll mention one of the plans white could have here is moving his knight out of the way and then maneuvering the rook all the way over to h4 and get some play against that h-pawn. Okay, so there, white did have control of the open file because he was able to plant his rook on that advanced point, but he closes down the file. He's traded his advantage on the file for a different advantage, which is that protected passed pawn. Okay, finally we'll look at one last position, which occurred in a game that Nimzowitsch played. Nimzowitsch was white, so we'll see how he played out this particular game. He mentions his opponent was simply an amateur, doesn't mention the name. Okay, so Nimzowitsch moves knight to f4, and he says you should always be thinking about developing moves like that, even if you're past the opening. It's a good square for the knight. And then the amateur plays rook a g8. Okay, now rook h7, posting that rook on that far advanced point on that file, threatening to double the rooks on that file. Okay, bishop to e8, we'll talk about why that move was made in just a minute. And now white does double up the rooks, and that forces black to trade rooks, and that gives white this passed pawn. So rook to h8, and now Nimzowitsch plays knight to g6 check, and you can see why the amateur moved his bishop here in order to capture the knight, which now is forced. But that gives white a protected passed pawn on h7 now. Okay, black advances with his king, and now is a crucial moment. What's the best move for white here? The best move is rook to h5. For two reasons. You're cutting off the black king from advancing any further, but I think more importantly, you're stopping this pawn from advancing to f5, which would allow this king to move over and attack the g6 pawn, which is supporting the passed pawn on h7. So that controls everything, and now all white has to do is run black out of tempi. It's going to put black into zugzwang. It's going to push all of his pawns, bring his king up toward the center, and eventually drive the black king back like that. And then he's going to push his e-pawn, trade off the pawns, and bring his rook to f5. And here black resigned because he simply can't stop the rook from infiltrating on f7 and taking that pawn, and he's going to queen a pawn. Okay, so that's my understanding of chapter 2. There were, several more examples and a few more things said here and there, but that's the gist of it. Okay, thanks for watching the video.